right, good morning everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning for a briefing on public safety in the community. I want to thank Sheriff Milstead, State's Attorney Daniel Hager. They're going to be joining us as well here in a little bit. We try to do this a couple times a year, but the goal today was to have this be kind of a more well-rounded press conference with some of our partners in public safety. So thank you guys for being here today. Just kind of some opening comments. Just want to start off by, first stressing the safety of this community and how Sioux Falls is still a very safe community to live in. I feel that. I think our residents feel that overall. But there certainly is crime issues that we have to manage and work through as a city, as a community. Many of the crime issues that we see in our community, especially the last several years, have been really cyclical crime issues. People that have been known to us in law enforcement, have been known to us in the community, people that we've seen before, potentially on parole, potentially people that have had previous arrests by our law enforcement. And so because of that, we see some trends that are increasing, some crime trends that are decreasing, and some that are flat. And so if we look at the ones that are increasing, the uptick, there's a few factors that I think are driving that we've seen in this community. One is, and just being very transparent, there's more firearms in our community. There's more guns in our community. And we are a state that loves the Second Amendment, and as do I, but there are more firearms, and there's also more people that quite honestly are willing to use firearms. The days of fisticuffs have given way to people willing to use their guns in altercations, and that's just the reality. It's also why Sam Clemens is up here ad nauseum telling people to lock their car doors, because one of the number one things that's stolen out of unlocked cars are guns, and people having their guns in their car. And so we can't foot stomp that enough on how important that is. We also see more people out on parole. There are more parolees in our community than ever before. Even in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a roughly 50% increase in the number of people in our community who are out on parole. And we have also a high number of what we call absconders, where the parole system has lost track of these folks. I can actually even highlight that with a recent incident we had, a recent homicide, our Labor Day homicide in Sioux Falls. The suspect in that crime had received a multiple-year jail sentence last year, got out on parole after only a few months, was an absconder. The system lost track of him, and he committed a homicide and got a hold of a gun somehow, obviously not legally, because he couldn't get a gun legally because he's on parole. And so that homicide on Labor Day highlights a lot of issues that we're trying to deal with here in Sioux Falls to make sure the community stays safe. Also, never a popular topic, but a necessary topic, is the needed funding for jails and for prisons. I think Minnehaha County is a good example of a community that invested a lot of money in a jail in the last several years because we need it. Jails are part of safe communities. I wish we didn't need them. I wish we didn't need a new prison up the hill, but we do. And so we have to support our legislators and our state leaders who are going to push for that in future sessions, because I think that's going to be coming, and that's an important investment in our communities that we need to keep making. And I'll tell you one thing, kind of as an aside, if we think that legalizing marijuana in the fall is going to lead to a safer community, we have another thing coming. And so I'm not going to get into that topic in detail today. We're going to be talking about that more. But if introducing another vice and another Class 1 narcotic is going to lead to a safer community, if we think that's the case, it's not the case. And so we have a lot of work to do on that front as well. So I want to show a slide here. I think it's important to keep some things in perspective. Let's see if I can advance this here. There we go. So what you're looking at here are violent crime and property crime rates per capita, so per 1,000 residents. So as you can see, through last year, both of these numbers over the past decade have stayed fairly flat, right? This is per capita numbers. So what this doesn't take into account, though, is the fact that we've added in 20 and 21 probably 10,000 people to our community. So if you have 5 to 6 violent crimes per 1,000 people and you add 10,000 people, that's 50, 60 more violent crimes that you have in a community. Now, is it keeping on par with where we've been historically? It has been. I think this is a chart of all the charts that we look at. This is the one I watch the most because it's when this line starts to get out of whack with your per capita population that, in my opinion, you do have a community that has a safety issue and has a crime issue. As the chief will talk about, we've had 5 homicides this year. We had 5 last year. We had 12 in 2020. So I just want to continue to reinforce the safety of this community. What we're going to be doing, though, and you've seen in my almost 5 years in the office now, is you'll see a lot of support out of our administration, budgetarily in other areas for men and women of the Sioux Falls Police Department and the work that they do. Everything from a $50 million public safety training facility to make sure we have the best officers trained in the right way, to the budget, which was passed just a week ago, which again adds the appropriate number of officers to keep up with the growth of the community and in making sure that they're resourced in the right way. So we are working closely with partners at the state level, county level, municipal level. Just last week we had a very good call with the Secretary of Corrections of the DOC, Kelly Wasco. The governor's office was on that call. But the other group that was on that call was all of our counterparts in Pennington County. Chief Allender, Pennington County Sheriff Tome, the Pennington County State's Attorney, because our 2 counties and our 2 cities, just being candid, most of the criminal activity tends to land in Sioux Falls or Rapid City. We are the landing spot for a lot of that. And so we are facing a lot of the same challenges in Sioux Falls that they are in Rapid City. And so we've begun a lot of dialogue about that, about shared collaboration, shared resources, shared things that we maybe need to lobby our legislature on. You'll maybe hear us talk about SB 70 and maybe some of the legislative tweaks we need to consider to that Senate bill from a decade ago, and some good parts to that bill for sure. Maybe there's some unintended consequences that we have to consider. And so in closing, I'm gonna turn it over to Sheriff Milstead, but I want to share with you, this is a story. This is the reality of our situation here in Sioux Falls. Safe community, but it's not without its challenges. And I got a letter, and honestly, I get a lot of letters from inmates in the jail. I have a lot of in the prison, at the state pen. I have a lot of connections I've made up there. And I got a letter recently from an inmate up at the prison. And he sent this to me. This was about 3 weeks ago. Mayor, I'm in prison. I've been locked up for a long time. I've been free for 8 months since 1996. I'm going to be 40 next month. I've been a gang leader, and he talks about his crime, and there's some victims to this guy's crime. Okay, there's a reason he's been locked up this much. I feel like this is my last chance, so I'm writing to you to please find me appropriate housing for someone of my criminal background. I want and I need to be successful, but I don't have any skills or trades. I'm going to be getting my parole next July, and I'm going to be staying here in your city. So please help me with housing and a job for a felon of my stature. I felt God leading me to write you. So I share that story with you because I wish all the felons had that wherewithal to realize, hey, he's got a year left, and he knows he's going to be in a tough spot when he gets out. And he says, I'm going to be staying in your city. I'm going to get released up the hill, and they're going to stay here. He needs housing. He needs a job. And if he doesn't get those things, he's going to be one of those cyclical offenders that we see in our community. And so that's why when we talk about the topic of crime and public safety, it's very much a holistic issue that relies on the community, mentorship. It relies on our cops to do their job. It relies on the DOC and the sentencing system to provide fair and just punishment. It relies on our parole system to be what our public intends it to be and have expectation. It relies on our legislators to also put laws into place that give us the tools we need to do our job and keep our community safe. So there's a lot of facets to the topic of public safety, and that's why I'm honored to have some of our partners here today to talk about this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Minnehaha County Sheriff Mike Milstead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before I go to my remarks, I must say that for you to take a position of leadership on the recreational marijuana issue is bold. And I think it was something that the public needs to hear and needs to understand, and it's something I support 100%. Recreational marijuana is not right for South Dakota from my standpoint, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. Oftentimes, I'll pull up the next slide, or
Sam's got you on here.
Sam, got her, okay. Oftentimes in these briefings, we wanted to expand it a little bit. I appreciate the mayor inviting myself and the state's attorney Hager to do that. We're seeing in our community more of a direct connection between our violent crimes, a high percentage of our violent crimes, and the use and distribution of illegal drugs. In particular, the drugs that are poisoning our community are methamphetamine, fentanyl, and marijuana, in particular high concentration or high THC marijuana. When you hear those, there was a day, and the mayor mentioned it, but there was a day when some of the drug dealers carried firearms. Well, it's changed completely now. Drug dealers are carrying firearms, and drug users, many of the drug users of these drugs, are willing to arm themselves. It's what Sam Clemens talks about with the open cars. The mayor mentioned stolen guns. There's a lot of stolen guns on the street. They're in the hands of people often involved in the drug market. If you notice down at the bottom, 25 firearms were seized from drug offenders from the Drug Task Force last year. 19 of those were people on meth or using methamphetamine. As you know, methamphetamine greatly impacts your ability to think. It makes you paranoid, delusional. You're extremely high risk, and to put guns in the hands of those individuals is looking for a disaster. The fentanyl, obviously, causing a lot of our overdose deaths, skyrocketing overdose deaths nationwide. It's a crisis. Over 105,000 deaths from overdose. About 2/3 of those in the U.S. are fentanyl. We're seeing it a little different in Minnehaha County. Last year, 35 overdose deaths, which was a 40% increase, and 133% increase over the last 5 years in overdose deaths. We have quite a few methamphetamine overdose deaths. It was about equal between methamphetamine and fentanyl. So we're just seeing a more potent methamphetamine on the streets here, and certainly fentanyl, where a lethal dose is roughly 2 milligrams. If they're off in a pill by a milligram, it's the difference between life and death. Again, increased prevalence of guns being carried by the offenders. Oftentimes these offenders are under the supervision of probation or parole. That is not to point fingers, but it's a reality. We surveyed the jail just recently in August. 41% of the people in our county jail were also on, at the time, probation or parole. We had 103 in custody that were parole, and 187 that were on some form of probation. So as the mayor indicated, these are people that we continue to run into over and over with our police officers. Oftentimes these individuals get involved in the drug activity. A lot of them are parole absconders, as you know. I think the absconder number is well over 400 parole absconders. Those are parolees who the Department of Corrections and the sheriffs and the police have no idea where they're at. So those individuals, our warrant task force in particular, works closely with the Department of Corrections, attempting to apprehend these parole absconders. They are some of the most dangerous people that our officers deal with because they know they're headed back to prison if they're caught. And so they're often ready to run. They're often sometimes in stolen vehicles. They're often armed. And it's a very high-risk situation for our police officers. Quite frankly, I've been in this job for a long time. As you know, over 24 years on the Sioux Falls PD, 25 years as your sheriff. I have never been more concerned about the safety of our men and women in uniform than I am today. The mayor pointed out we still live in a very safe community, and I agree 100%. But the issue that we're facing is more and more dangerous individuals who are carrying guns and willing to use them, in part because of the individuals who in our own community leave their car unlocked and leave their gun in there. And I appreciate citizens who arm themselves, who are strong supporters of the Second Amendment. I just ask that you responsibly lock up your car if you've got a gun in your vehicle and keep from putting hands in these criminals. Number one, they're a criminal because they're breaking into your car. And number two, they're a felon that probably shouldn't, that can't possess a firearm anyway. But we're encountering them more and more times. We had a recent case in August where we were working with the police department, our task force and the Sioux Falls PD, in trying to identify and apprehend 9 different individuals related to threats, started with a threat on law enforcement. We arrested 9 people. All 9 were on either probation or parole. There was nobody that hadn't been was not on a level of supervision. So 9 out of 9 were on probation or parole. We took 4 guns off the street from those individuals. One of them was illegally modified. And so these are the types of individuals our police officers are dealing with at a higher rate. Year-to-date task force seizures, as you'll see, and the chief will talk a little bit about the seizures. Next slide. One of the things that we hear commonly, people ask, Sheriff, tell me a little bit about these pills, the fentanyl in particular. This is what we're dealing with. Last year, the Drug Task Force, which is a multi-jurisdictional, it's Sioux Falls PD, Minnehaha County Sheriff, it's got the DEA officers, ATF helps with us. DCI is a big part of our task force. Anyway, when you look at the fentanyl seizures from Sioux Falls and from that task force this past year or year to date this year, this is primarily what we're seeing. It's the M30 counterfeit pills, which contain fentanyl. Last year alone, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, seized 20 million counterfeit pills containing fentanyl. 20 million. 4 out of every 10 were lethal doses. You have a better chance with Russian roulette than you do with the fentanyl that is being counterfeited. So, and typically, while we're seeing primarily M30s in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County, they're also stamped into pills that appear to be Valium, Xanax, and Ativan. So if we go to the next slide, when you talk a little bit about where these drugs come from, the National Drug Threat Assessment released last year, the key findings, as it's been recently and it continues to be, Mexican transnational criminal organizations are the greatest criminal drug threat in the United States. Illicit fentanyl is the primary drug fueling the epidemic of overdose deaths in the United States, while heroin and prescription opioids remain a significant challenge to public health and law enforcement. Mexican cartels are increasingly responsible for producing and supplying fentanyl to the U.S. market. China remains a key source supply for the precursor chemicals that the Mexican cartels use to produce the large amounts of fentanyl they are smuggling into the United States. Drug poisoning deaths or overdoses and seizures involving methamphetamine have risen sharply as Mexican transnational criminal organizations increase the drug's availability and expand the domestic market. What this comes down to is, where are these drugs coming from? probably 90% of the methamphetamine and fentanyl that is hitting the borders of South Dakota and Minnehaha County come across the southwest border. I was offended to hear the Vice President, quite frankly, say last week that our southwest border is secure. I chair the National Sheriff's Association Drug Enforcement Committee. I interact with our southern border sheriffs on a regular basis. The border is not secure. These drugs and people illegally entering the U.S. are coming at an unprecedented rate, and it's bringing these drugs into our country, and they know it. I mean, to sum up what's happening is China sends the precursors, China sends the chemicals to Mexico. The Mexican drug cartels they blend, press, and stamp into counterfeit pills that contain fentanyl. And then those are smuggled across the border into the U.S. The other way they're getting into the U.S. or into your homes or into our homes is through e-commerce and through actual, through the black market and through the internet, through the dark web. People are able to actually get some of these drugs delivered to their home by the U.S. Postal Service, UPS, and FedEx. It still all involves the Mexican drug cartels, still all involves China, and it still all involved the criminal network and international drug trade. So I want to bring it a little bit to home. The next slide will show you the South Dakota methamphetamine seizures. As you'll see, that Minnehaha County really accounts for about, year to date, about a third of the methamphetamine that is seized in the state of South Dakota has been seized in Minnehaha County, and a considerable amount also out in Rapid City and Pennington County. If we move to the next slide, the mayor talked a little bit about how some of this violent crime lands in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County, Rapid City, and Pennington County. One of the other things that lands in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County and Rapid and Pennington County are people on parole. The reality is the parole officers primarily are in our two jurisdictions have very hardworking professional parole officers from the Department of Corrections. But because we have the resources in Rapid City and Sioux Falls, many of the people are released on parole into our community that didn't commit a crime in our community, but because there may not be rural services where they committed their crime, they land in our community when they're released from the prison. I appreciate the call that we had. The mayor organized a call with the governor's office and Secretary Wasco last week. We had a great conversation, and in fact, I was encouraged by what the secretary said. We talked about the fact that all the parolees seem to land in our two communities, and she had a strong desire to look at opportunities that they have that she's seen in other states where they're able to provide rural services, parole services, so that they don't all land here. Because there are some cases where an individual wants to just get away from this environment, get away, not live in a halfway house, wants to live at home somewhere, wants to move back to farm, wants to be with their parents. But because the parole services aren't available there, it makes that parole plan not one that could be accepted. So I appreciate her willingness to look at some of these things. There's some states that when you're released from parole, you're released only to your home county where you committed the crime or where you lived, instead of dumping everybody in just two jurisdictions or three jurisdictions. You go back to the county where you committed the crime. Well, I certainly would probably be voting for that one if I had a chance to. But the reality is, I understand that Department of Corrections doesn't have parole officers statewide that can do that right now. But it's certainly something, I think, as our group was talking, we talked about the importance of having these discussions and looking at opportunities. And some of these things can be changed by policies. Some of them may need change through the legislature. But for the governor's office and the Secretary of Corrections to be willing to work with us on this, I think is a great start. I think we've had conversations with the Unified Judicial System, UJS, that oversees probation instead of parole. We had 187 people on probation in our jail recently, so that's obviously another component that we need to look at. So policy changes, legislation, all those are possibilities. And also there's another, there's some states that just did away with parole. They've gone to truth in sentencing. So, for example, in Texas, if you're sentenced to prison for 10 years, you're going to have to serve 8.5 years. You have to serve 85% of your sentence, and then they eliminate parole. So reviewing the whole parole system is, I think without being critical of it, when we see the number of people on probation and parole committing crimes, it's a great opportunity, I think, for us as leaders in our cities or counties and for our state leaders to say, let's revisit it. Let's look at Senate Bill 70. Do we need to revisit the sanctioning grid? So I don't think there's any finger pointing. I think what we're trying to do here is increase the public's awareness that there's a lot of elements involved in public safety, and one of them is the lack of a statewide access to mental health and drug and treatment resources in and out of custody. I made a comment about 15 years ago. I said if I was king, and I'm not king, but if I was king, I would find a centralized, in-custody, inpatient treatment center for individuals in prison or jail. And if a county has to send somebody there, let's just say it was at the old Plankington facility. If the county sends someone there, the county pays for it. But so many of these individuals are so heavily addicted to drugs like methamphetamine that require long-term treatment that I just don't think we have adequate mental health and drug treatment facilities in the state to deal with the population, because I will guarantee you that many of these individuals who are parole absconders because they're using drugs. They know they're going to test hot when they go to their parole officer, and so they're on the lam, they're out on the run, and they're committing other crimes because they're back involved in drugs. And so having good drug treatment availability is important for us. And also having adequate prison beds. And I mentioned, the mayor mentioned that before. Nobody wants to have to build a $65 million or $100 million prison. Quite frankly, we have two choices. Either you have enough prison beds and jail beds to hold people accountable for crime and to have them there as a consequence for committing crimes, or you relinquish and give up public safety. And I know what South Dakotans want. I know what people in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County want. They want safe streets. They want safe communities. And sometimes you have to build jails and prisons. And as we look at justice reform, which we have in our federal government, we have in our state government, and we do here in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County, I look at justice reform with a focus on public safety, not the number of people in jail or prison. When I look at the state statute, and it talks about the sheriff, it lists what my duties are. My duties are not to reduce the county jail population. That's nowhere in the state statute. My duties, it's the preservation of peace and the protection of life and property. That's what my job is. And so my goal is to keep as many people in jail as we need to keep our community safe. That's my goal. If we can safely reduce jail numbers, I'm okay with that. I'm all for looking at options to safely reduce jail numbers. But I am not a supporter of judging justice reform by counting how many people are in jail today or tomorrow. My goal is to keep this community safe. With that, and we'll take some questions a little bit later, but State's Attorney Daniel Hager is here to talk a little bit about the prosecution of cases.
I want to start by just thanking Mayor Tenhaken, Sheriff Milstead, and Chief Toom for their leadership and their commitment to public safety. I think even in the past few years, you've seen what good leadership can do to law enforcement in our community. Chief Toom has talked about not biting on the trend of reducing the resources that we put to law enforcement, and that pays dividends, and it allows us to have these conversations and know that we have enough law enforcement in the community that we can address issues when we encounter them. And so their leadership has put us in a good spot, and so I appreciate this conversation and that continued leadership there. The state's attorney's office in Minnehaha County, I'm grateful to be elected to get to lead that. There are 36 lawyers and 30 support staff in that office, and they're committed to justice. They are hardworking, true public servants. And so I appreciate each one of them as we see these issues, because I know that they are willing to roll their sleeves up and do that hard work that we have to do when we see rising crime. The state's attorney's role and the prosecutor's role, a lot of time it's reactionary. You know, we see all of that crime that law enforcement, whether it's the sheriff's office, the police department, the state investigators, when they're bringing those cases, when they're seeing that crime on the streets, we're prosecuting it. You know, we're prosecuting tens of thousands of cases, new cases every year. And so we see a lot of that. And there's a lot of brave people on the streets who are dealing with rising violent crime. And so we're trying to react to that and support them with good, tough-nosed prosecution. We're going to seek justice. We're going to look at that and say, okay, can we rehabilitate this person? Is there education? Is there restitution? Or does there have to be incarceration in the jail and penitentiary system? We're willing to do that. This is an important conversation. It's important to have it with the community. We know that the citizens of Sioux Falls, Minnehaha County, they want to know what's happening in the community, and so we're happy to talk about that. I think that there is some optimism that can be shared. I'm a serious person, but I like to share that when I can. If you are not involved in the drug community, we live in a safe community. You know, a lot of these individuals who are committing this violent crime, they're known to law enforcement. So if you're not known to law enforcement, that's a good thing. We live in a safe community. We have repeat offenders, and my office is committed to holding people accountable through personal responsibility. And we're going to make sure that if we have people on probation, people on parole who are committing those violent crimes, we are going to prosecute that and do that well. I've moved an individual over to the felony crimes against persons team, so we've added a prosecutor to focus on that violent crime that targets individuals. One thing that I always want the community to remember is when we see, you know, murder statistics or rape, violent crime, there's always a victim on the other side of that. You know, so when you talk about, well, it went up this percentage, those are people in our community who are being victimized. And that's not okay. And so we're going to do everything we can to make sure that those victims are made as whole as they can be, and that those offenders are punished. I think that we can do certain things with our law enforcement and as a community to address this rising crime. We can have law enforcement and state's attorneys targeting specific activity. We can do that, and we can do that well. As a community, I know that we're starting to harp on it, but I think it's important. Make it hard for people to commit violent crime. Don't leave firearms in cars that are unlocked, right? Secure your firearms. You don't want one of your guns used to shoot at law enforcement, to shoot at children, innocent people. And so you can make it harder for them to obtain firearms if you're just safe with those. You can get involved in mentoring. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to raise strong children than fix broken men. I think we're seeing that. So when the mayor talks about mentoring, get involved, mentor those individuals, whether they're children, whether they're individuals who are looking for that as adults. Be involved, and we can be a good community. With neighbors, and this is a hard thing to do, but be willing to hold each other accountable. If you have neighbors who are engaging in violent crime and committing other crimes, hold them accountable. Work with law enforcement. Be willing to say, this is what I saw. Even though that's hard to do, cooperate with law enforcement. When we're prosecuting that, when we have to call you into court, that's really difficult. It's difficult to come in. It's uncomfortable, but it's very important to work with prosecutors so that we can make sure that that individual is held personally accountable. With leaders, I would encourage them, and this is for myself as well, support law enforcement. Make sure that you're giving law enforcement officers the people that they need, the technology. My office is very grateful for the county commission. They invested into new case management software for us, right? Not exciting to talk about, but that type of trust and investment, that puts us in a good position to deal with rising crime. I'm going to close here, and then Chief Toom will come up and talk more about numbers. But again, I think we live in a great community. We have the opportunity to have these conversations before things get really bad. And that's a good thing. It's good that we can talk about it. We can be comfortable. We have leaders who want to do that. We can always look and say, okay, this is something that we're doing well. This is something we can do better. And so that's a good thing. We have great law enforcement. We're serious about public safety. We're serious about crime. We're serious about having this conversation. Thank you.
Morning, Chief John Toom, Sioux Falls Police Department. Again, thank the three gentlemen who spoke before me, and what you'll hear from all of us is a common theme, which is collaboration. When the topic of crime comes up, typically we look towards law enforcement and prosecution and government as being the primary stakeholder. However, what you're hearing from us today, and I want everybody to take notice, is that this is everybody's position to be in, right? We all have a stakeholder in this. We all have a part to play. And again, we talk about collaboration, and I think that's going to be key for us moving forward. I just want you to take note of that. Again, this is part of our annual crime update that we do every year. Again, this is a broader scope, so we are going to hit some numbers here. We'll be at the informational tomorrow at the City Council for more detailed numbers. We're just going to highlight some today quick, as again, you've been a very good audience, and we want to be respectful of your time. This slide here just shows our clearance rates in primary crime categories from homicide, rape, robbery, and all different crime stats that we see here from the past couple years. And what I want to look at this is just our clearance rate is far and above in almost all areas the national average. And I want to stress this because law enforcement, we do our job at an outstanding level. Sheriff's Office, Police Department, our local partners from both state, we take great pride in what we do and how we do our job. And that starts from the officers on the streets to our investigators. And again, we are put a strong emphasis on serving the community, and especially in these clearance rates, we take it as our personal mission and objective to make sure that we do the best we can when it comes to some of these cases. And again, we wanted to point that and highlight that because sometimes that gets lost in numbers, and we want to make sure that we highlight the great job our officers are doing every day. If we look at calls for service, these are numbers from 20, 21, and 22 through August. Again, we're taking like data from each year. And you'll see our calls for service are actually pretty steady, sitting around that 86,000 range. We've noticed that that's kind of where it's been. And again, as our population grows dramatically, we're not seeing the same increase in calls for service that we are in population. Again, that can change very quickly, but just worth noting is that's always a number that people like to see. With that, our online reports, we've been commenting on this quite a bit for the past couple of years about this online reporting tool that people can make for some of our low-level offenses that aren't happening right at that moment. Those continue to go up, and what it shows is a community that's willing to kind of listen to us a little bit. We're like, hey, if you can use this online reporting option, that frees up some of our officers to do some more in the field police work and allows us to do that. I just wanted to highlight this because it just shows, again, the community's involvement. And one of the things you'll see within Sioux Falls is that the residents of Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County aren't just willing to let crime be crime and not report it. I think we report at a high level because of that partnership we have with the community and our repeated messaging that if something happens, we want to know. And if you see something, say something. If you look at our homicide numbers through August, again, you'll take note that it's 3, it is 5 for the year so far, but this is through August. Again, in 2020, we were at 8, 2021 had 2 at this point of the year, and 3 this year. So again, just kind of put in context, a lot of times the news stories and what we see, we kind of look at the year-to-year basis and kind of see what those trends are doing and where we're at. Again, we're not pleased with any homicide, but we're also not naive to think that we're not going to deal with that annually. And again, what we're seeing and how we're dealing with it. And when it comes to homicides, ultimately clearance rates come up, and I think that's something that we want to ask. People watch a lot of TV, and they watch a lot of CSI. We put our whole hearts into these investigations. We really take it as a personal measure of pride and our honor to see justice in these cases. Some are solved within hours and some take time. And know that we always work and are always efforting to solve these cases. And again, in CSI and TV, it's usually solved within an hour. The reality is that these investigations are challenging and difficult, but we do our best to give our best effort to seek justice for those victims and their families. Assaults, what you'll see, the blue number is aggravated assaults, and then the orange is domestic. And so how those weave in there is just how we want to look at the domestic component and then the aggravated assaults. Again, 2021, we defied national trends a little bit. 2021 saw a spike in crime. 2021 nationwide saw that continue to elevate, and we're seeing that in some areas. We had kind of a statistical thing where we actually went down in 2021, defying some national trends. And that's why the 2020 numbers in here as well. You can kind of see that while we have seen an uptick in some of these assaults, it is very similar to where we were in 2020 after that downturn in 2021. But obviously this is the topic of conversation. We're seeing, in some of the other reasons that the previous gentleman mentioned, we're seeing a lot of repeat offenders. We're seeing a lot of people who are no stranger to our system. And here's another just interesting phenomenon we're dealing with. I had our detectives pull stats for aggravated assaults in August. The majority of the suspects within those crimes were not strangers to the justice system. But an interesting anomaly was multiple cases where the suspect was known by the victim, but the victim would not provide cooperation with us on who that suspect is or any part of the investigation. So here's another just topic we're dealing with when some of the other guys were talking about crime or who you're hanging out with. Assaults are still mostly people who you commit crimes with, do drugs with, or who you love, sadly, are the primary things that we see when assaults happen. But what we're seeing again is this alarming rise, especially amongst young people, to some code of snitching or some code of not cooperating. And the reality is that when people are committing violent crimes and victims aren't cooperating with that, they get the opportunity to commit violent crimes again and again and produce multiple victims. That's one of the challenges we're seeing in law enforcement. That's something I want to speak to young people about specifically when it comes to violent crime. Is just understand that these are the repercussions of not cooperating when somebody commits a violent crime and known suspect. And again, I'd be lying if I saying it wasn't rather aggravating to us when someone is shot or stabbed and they know who did it and they will not provide us the information, because when a crime against persons happens, the primary source of evidence and usually intelligence that gets to the bottom of cases is the human element, the human cooperation. So just wanted to highlight that in that area. If we go to rape, our numbers are down. Again, just want to provide that as we go through. If we go look at robberies are up. And we noticed this early in the year that we saw a spike in some of our robberies. Now, robbery is the forceful taking of something from somebody or something, right? What we're seeing when we really dig into the robbery numbers is not so much if it's casino robberies or gas station robberies. We'll always have a certain number of them. It's people stealing from each other, sometimes very inconsequential things. Any of you media agencies who kind of follow some of the scanner traffic know that a phone gets taken from somebody or somebody gets beat up at a park or something like that. So the robbery numbers really are pretty broad, everything from a bank robbery to taking of somebody's cell phone on the streets. And there's varying levels of weapons displayed and stuff like that. But again, we were onto this trend a little earlier in the year and are monitoring closely. And we're not seeing any trends. I think in the past you've seen in Sioux Falls there was a string of casino robberies or a string of gas station robberies. We're not seeing any prevailing trends, but an increase in just people robbing from each other is important. And again, robberies are not burglaries. Sometimes we struggle with definitions on that. Burglaries are, into an occupied or unoccupied structure where things are taken. And again, we're seeing those numbers after an uptick in 2021, maintaining really in 2022. We mentioned fentanyl seizures. Again, 2021, we had a record year for fentanyl seizures, just seizing and seeing fentanyl like never before. And we had a record number of deaths that year too from fentanyl and meth overdose. So many times as law enforcement, the onus is like, well, law enforcement needs to go out and take more drugs off the street. Take more drugs off the street. Well, we took record amounts of drugs off the street and had record deaths last year. I'm here to tell you that we're part of that system. We're part of that equation, but we are not the whole system on that. So much of it comes to prevention. And again, I just told myself I would say this every time I had a pulpit to use it when it comes to fentanyl. Again, speaking to young people. Some people, again, the sheriff had a pretty good slide on that. If you're buying your drugs from a drug dealer, I think it's a safe bet that it's probably not a legitimate pharmaceutical grade drug if you're not getting it from a pharmacy. And then you should really question as to what's in there. some people know that there's fentanyl in there. And you don't get a second chance on fentanyl, right? As specified, Russian roulette is a safer bet sometimes when it comes to these. So for young people out there who are thinking about this drug, and again, our officers, I've been off the streets for a while now, but our officers are still responding to these calls. It's very impactful when you go to a call, especially to a dead young person, and hear the cries of their mother or the cries of their family or the cries of their brothers and sisters, all because of a fentanyl pill, and sometimes just one. And again, if the pill is being smoked or crushed up or taken in any means other than just, again, there's a high probability and high likelihood that there could be a serious concern. So while we can crow and be really excited about our record number of fentanyl seizures, just understand, yeah, that's law enforcement doing its job better than ever before. Extremely proud of our task force as far as how we go out there and take drugs off the street. But as long as the demand is there, the supply will be there as well, as we've covered in the past too. So, meth seizures, again, record year last year seizing, but a lot of our overdoses were also meth related too. Again, methamphetamine, we've covered time and time again how bad of a drug it is. And again, with the variety of topics we've covered today, just one more to think about and focus on. Again, as I conclude my part, we're going to open up for questions a little bit, but understand this. Again, we are going to be upfront with this. We're going to talk about what we're seeing and what we're experiencing as a community, but ultimately be realistic about law enforcement's role in this. We are one part of this conversation. Many other people that we need to collaborate with, work with, and be open and have honest conversations without getting our feelings hurt, so to speak. That involves the community. I'm just going to anecdotally provide that people who volunteer and get out and invest in the lives of young people are making huge impacts in that community. People who invest in the lives of people who are coming out of jail or coming out of prison to get them on the right path and to get them set up to be successful, that's an outstanding thing. And that's something that we all can agree on and all participate in. But if we're only talking after the trigger's pulled, it's a little too late. It's a little too late for everybody involved, primarily for the victim. And let's not lose sight of that too, but also the suspects and the people who are getting involved in these violent crimes. So the holistic look at our community and what we're doing together to work on these issues, as well as within our state, is a conversation that the city and the county, and we've talked with our partners across the state. We're already having these conversations, and we want to talk more about what we can do to make things better and to make positive inroads in areas that are very, very difficult. So at this time, we'll open up to any questions that you may have for the mayor or the sheriff or the state's attorney or myself.